This is an episode of Unconfined, a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu. Mike Milley is our sound engineer and produced our theme music. Your hosts are me, Tom Philpott, and Christine Grillo. Paulette Wilson is the producer, and Natalie Wood-Wright is the executive producer. The opinions expressed here are not necessarily those of Johns Hopkins University or of the Center for a Livable Future. Well, welcome to this edition of Unconfined Podcast, and we're in our regenerative agriculture series, and we're extremely excited to have really two of the most important voices out there who cover and write about and think about regenerative agriculture. And I'm referring to the writing team of David Montgomery and Ann Biklé. Let me just really briefly introduce them individually. David is a geomorphologist at University of Washington, and he's most famous, for his work on soil and regenerative agriculture and the way that soils have shaped human civilizations, and his, more recent work on regenerative agriculture. But, behind the scenes earlier in his career, maybe still to this day, we can ask him. He has worked in mountain ranges throughout the world, from the Cascades in the Pacific Northwest to the Andes in South America, and Tibet, and to the Himalayas in Central Asia. And his writing and life partner, Ann Biklé, is a master gardener, and she, with backgrounds in biology and natural history, and she's got a master's in landscape architecture from the University of California at Berkeley. And this team has come together and created this a really incredible body of work on regenerative agriculture and the connections between soil health and human health. And they've written two books together, one called What Your Food Ate, which is our more recent one. And the other one is Hidden Half of Nature, which is about the soil and human microbiome. So Ann and David, welcome to Unconfined Podcast.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
It is. I love the name too.
Thank you. Yeah, we cannot be confined.
I know. And I mean, one thing I often say about myself is, I'm a biologist of the free range sort. So
yes, a free range biologist. That's great. So, we are podcasting here literally from the depths of a school for public health. So let's start really basic and talk about really what I think is you guys' great topic, the connection between soil health and human health. And in your 2015 book, Hidden Half of Nature, you tease out the connection by telling really kind of two stories that are kind of told in parallel in the book. And that is turning your sort of conventional grass yard in Seattle into a food garden alongside a bout that Ann had with cancer. And I wonder if you could just sort of talk about how these two stories intersect and what they tell us about the connection between public health and soil health.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, Tom, I mean, these two things intersected, both my bout with cancer, which was cervical cancer, and writing this book, and in the midst of everything that goes along with taking care of a garden. And so it was really quite a surprise in doing all the research for that book to be really taking a deep dive into microbiomes, and that immediately leads to the immune system. And then here I was with cancer asking myself, well, wait a minute. I thought the immune system was supposed to knock out the cancer cells. So what is going on here? And there's a ton of different kinds of cancers. Cervical cancer and a few others are known to be connected to a virus, HPV. And so it's not really a diet-related cancer. However, when I started to read up on, well, what how do you get a fully functioning, robust immune system that can knock out viruses, that can take out other stuff? And then all of that circled back to diet and food. And in the midst of doing all of this research, really what I came to learn about immune systems and microbiomes, it's like one of the biggest oversights in a lot of different fields, ranging from medicine to agronomy. And that is that, at least in mammals, our immune system is it has not only evolved to be able to pick out, pathogens, but it's just as geared to identifying, working with, in symbiosis, all of these microbes that are in us and on us. And this is, utterly contrary to how most people think about evolution and how they think about the history of life, which is, most of us have this predator-prey kind of classic model in our minds, that it's always about fighting and killing and this head-on conflict. And when it comes to microbiomes, and the more we look, the more we see that there are just as many examples, if not more, of symbioses. So these are relationships. I use this term a bit loosely, and so I'll just say that here. In my mind, and generally how I use it, symbioses are beneficial, mutually beneficial relationships. And it's come to find that that's how microbiomes work in the human body and in the plant body. And that when it comes to the plant and soil microbiome, plants are obviously different. Their roots are out there in the soil, and where they recruit their microbiome from, which is a large part of the plant immune system, the crop immune system, is from the soil at large. So you don't need to be a free-range biologist to know that if we are spraying, dumping, pouring, applying toxins and poisons onto the soil, there's a high likelihood that we're affecting the crop microbiome. And the last thing you want, the more that we know about microbiomes, the last thing you want is to be scuttling and jumbling up and injuring and harming and killing these communities, because they are central to immunity in plants and people. And so this is where, when you begin to look at human health and soil health, or public health and soil health, you begin to see that there's these roots. There's this fundamental kind of basis for health in plants and peoples, and an awful lot of that has to do with the microbiome. And kind of the standard lens with regard to public health and soil is that, and for good reason, the lens is usually one of, there's toxins in the soil and we need to know about those and stay away from them. So we don't want kids eating soil and things like that. But there's a much, much bigger story that is about how the things that we do with the human diet and with agriculture and with people's built environments and food deserts and so on, that impact people's microbiomes. And so that's sort of how these sort of two worlds meet. They're absolutely fundamental to the health of their host. And so there you go. That's kind of the way I see things with the microbiomes.
Yeah, and you can think about the relationship between soil health and human health at sort of two different scales. There's the scale of whole civilizations and societies and the broad public health lens. And there's also the individual body sense in terms of your health, my health, Anne's health. And I started out looking at the sort of the broader picture of the relationship of how people treat the land affects the health of the soil, and how that in turn affects the health and longevity of human societies. And as I was wrapping up that book, we bought a house in North Seattle, and Anne's a major league gardener, and it turned out we had crap soil that had no life in it, and she went on a major crusade to try and bring life back to our yard to actually make the garden that she wanted. And that was happening at the same time that her health issues were happening, that we were looking into it. And the parallels between those were just really striking in terms of the way that we treat the soil. And as it affects soil health, not only can affect how long we can keep farming in different regions of the world, but it affects what gets into our food and how that interfaces with our own immune system, as Anne was talking about. And when you start putting those sort of two scales, and that's kind of everything from us as individuals to us as an entire society, that there's connections that are really quite interesting and that have been overall relatively neglected in both our agricultural and our medical communities, and looking at the interface between the two. And that's really what sort of got us into trying to look at and think about these issues. And we never imagined, I think, when we started on this, that we'd end up writing 4 books on the topic. And here we are.
Yeah, here we are.
So one thing that I've really always admired about you guys since I've been reading your work is that I think you are major league science writers. You're just incredible at taking in science across a broad range of disciplines and sort of translating it, putting it into English, teasing out what it means in a way that lay people can understand it. And one of the things that I've gotten from reading your work is this concept that Anne was just talking about, symbiosis, about the way that that we need to sort of feed certain things to our human microbiome, and when we feed them sort of the right things, they create compounds that then help us. And there are similar things that happen in soil between the roots of a plant and the biome that surrounds it. I wonder if you could just give me a couple of examples, because I think it's some of the most exciting stuff. And maybe also in the answer comment on how, you know, the emerging the science around microbiota, both human and soil, is something that's really been gaining steam just in the past few decades. It's really just coming on. And just, you know, when you read something like, you know, probably 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when I started writing about this topic, I read some of Albert Howard's work. And in the 40s, he's already talking about the soil biome. And it seemed just sort of weird. You know, for those who don't know, Albert Howard was this British plant scientist who developed some ideas that became the basis, or, you know, formed a part of the basis for what we now call organic agriculture. And he was just sort of this kind of freak who was considered this fringe figure in science. But a lot of what he's saying was writing about is borne out. Am I correct?
Yeah, it's one of the very, very interesting story in terms of how science gets adopted. And there's a lot of examples we could go through, from like plate tectonics and some stuff in genetics and so forth. But Howard is a really good example of how somebody can have insights that were ahead of the science. So he was an agronomist. He was a very empirically oriented person, a practical person. He sort of like observed things and tried to connect the dots. And he was arguing about the importance of the role of the soil microbiome in soil health and crop health and human health in the 1930s and 40s, as were some others paying attention to similar things at the time. But the state of sort of mainstream science hadn't caught up to the point where they could understand how the connections actually worked. And a lot of that really took the development of gene sequencing technology, which is a much, much more recent development, obviously, that allowed people to study the ecology of microorganisms. You know, imagine, how would you study the way organisms that are too small to see actually interact, and that speak essentially in a language of chemistry. So Howard's story is, I think, a really good example of the science eventually catching up with somebody who had early insights that were well grounded, but he couldn't explain the mechanism behind how it would actually work. And if there's one thing scientists are really good at, is if you can't explain how something works, we're deeply skeptical about it.
Right. So let's get to that science that we know now. And Howard had a peer, Eve Balfour, and they were both onto fungi. They knew there was something critical going on with fungi. And what we know now is that, and they could never have seen this, but back to sort of your question about symbioses and examples, and why are crops and plants indeed having these symbioses in the first place? Are they just because it's nice and fuzzy and so on and so forth? No, it is, it's for a very good reason. So plants are gathering all this energy through photosynthesis. They're manufacturing these things called exudates that they push flow out of their root system into a very narrow zone around their roots. And these exudates are like breakfast, lunch, and dinner 24/7, and it's really high quality food. Okay.
For microbes.
For microbes. And so there it is sitting there at the roots, and these microbes come running like dogs to dinner all the time. And so, you start researching this and learning about it, and you're like, well, that's interesting. Why are the microbes running there other than eating? What exactly are they doing? Well, Tom, all kinds of things. They'll consume these exudates, and either from the energy they gain from this exudate or some precursor compound in the exudate, they'll turn around and they'll make other compounds and molecules and give them back to the plant in exchange for the exudates. So what kinds of things? Plant growth promoting hormones. So the plant has farmed out to the microbial world some molecules that help spur its growth. The botanical world has also farmed out the acquisition of nitrogen. These nitrogen-fixing bacteria are big, big members of the root microbiome in particular. And these nitrogen fixers, they're not just sitting there on the outside of the root. There's a type that live inside of a plant's roots where they fix nitrogen. And for anybody who isn't aware, maybe listening to this podcast, nitrogen is the plant world and plant growth and agriculture in particular revolve around nitrogen. It's probably one of the most critical things for plant growth. And so plants have farmed this out and have co-evolved with a number of different nitrogen fixing types of bacteria, as well as other bacteria that break down organic matter and get the nitrogen out of the organic matter and then send it off to their crop host. So the plant is stuck in place, right? It cannot get up and go do anything. So it has turned into a wizard and a master chemist and a sort of a master, relationship modulator kind of an organism. And it is working with its microbiome ceaselessly, day in, day out. And what drives all of that is those exudates, which we want plants to have a lot of exudates because it gives them a lot of functionality vis-a-vis their microbiome.
And interestingly enough, you can trace those kind of symbiotic relationships between fungi and plants back to the colonization of land by plants. When plants moved out of the seas onto land, it was enabled by partnerships with fungi that helped them acquire the nutrients they needed to thrive. Now, we didn't really know much about those kinds of relationships and the mutual benefit that can come from them until fairly recently. Yet it's been acting for 450 million years to shape our environment and our relationships between plants and the soil and all kinds of organisms in each other. And yet we're only realizing how to actually integrate that understanding into the way we grow our food. And what it's doing is it's reframing the way we think about soil fertility, and it should reframe how we think about farming.
Which gives us a good segue into the next question, and which is about the way we do farming, the dominant way we do farming now on most acres of U.S. farmland. And sort of going back to this connection between human health and soil health, what is the science telling us about what this rise of industrial agriculture, where we, apply lots of synthetic nitrogen to soil and other, phosphorus and potassium as well, where we apply insecticides to keep the insects at bay and fungicides to keep the fungus at bay. And we were just hearing about how important fungi are. And yet we have this, rise in fungicide use in U.S. farm country, especially in a place like the Corn Belt. What are we learning about, many decades of the style of agriculture being dominant? And what are we learning about what it's done to the nutrient density of our food?
That's a big question, Tom. And I'll just say this: there's studies that go back to before we were big into inputs, these synthetic inputs, and even after, that go back decades that show that when you add a lot of nitrogen, phosphorus in particular, plant metabolism responds. And a plant only has so much energy. So it's getting hit with this mother load of nitrogen and phosphorus. And energetically, to turn that into biomass, that becomes your whole game. That becomes the whole plant game. And what they do, where do they get that energy from to take in all this nitrogen, phosphorus? they kind of rob it from their exudate production. And so when you rob exudate production, you leave the soil and crop microbiome kind of high and dry. And, these are living organisms. And as I just said, these exudates are their meals. They're their nutrition. And you cut that off and they begin to die off. And they also begin to, change what they're doing. And so with respect to fertilizers in particular, and nitrogen again in particular, it messes with exudate production. And the minute you mess with exudate production, you're messing with microbiome functionality. And not only that, it's kind of this double whammy. With nitrogen, plants store that. All this nitrogen they're taking in from fertilizers, it gets stored as soluble sugars and amino acids. And there's some pests, they love that kind of food. So there they go. There they are sitting there in, acres and acres of a fast food restaurant for pests and pathogens.
We could even say square miles and square miles probably in the Corn Belt.
Yeah, let's do, because that's true. And so we're basically growing meals for pests and pathogens. And at the same time, because exudate production is so down in these crops, it's scuttling plant immunity, because a lot of these nutrient acquiring microbes, they wear multiple hats, Tom. So they're not just fetching phosphorus and fixing nitrogen. They're also really important for a plant's defensive repertoire and for plant immunity. So you knock them off the job, and then you've got square mile after square mile of fast food for pests and pathogens with crops who have had just severely compromised immunity, and then they get eaten up. And then out come the pesticides, insecticides, and fungicides. And by the way, there's fungi, pathogenic fungi, that also prefer soluble sugars and amino acids. And so plants are getting hit above ground and below ground. And so that's kind of the big gnarly thing about industrial agriculture and what synthetic inputs do to the microbiome.
And if you look back at sort of the history of behind the rapid adoption of large-scale chemical fertilizer use in the 20th century, the stage that was set on was that soils in North America and Western Europe were already degraded by centuries of tillage. So the act of plowing actually helps degrade soil organic matter. And you can think of organic matter as dead stuff, but it's also food for microbes. It's that and the exudates Anne have been talking about are really what helps support soil life and all the nutrient cycling and activity that helps promote fertility. So if you had degraded soils that responded really well to adding a bunch of nitrogen, which then undermined plant defensive systems, and you then went to monocultures to plant the same crop that, the grocery store for pests, you've basically set up a system that you should naturally expect the demand for herbicides and insecticides, pesticides in general, to go through the roof after our use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers went through the roof. And that's what you see in the record. And, nitrogen is nitrogen, but nitrogen comes in different packages. And with the synthetic fertilizers, we tend to make them soluble because people want that to be taken up by crops. But what it also means is that if it rains, that stuff gets dissolved in the water and goes where the water goes, into the groundwater, into a well, into a stream, into a river, into the ocean, where it causes other problems. Whereas in organic matter, that same nitrogen is sort of locked up until the biology gets it out and trades it to a plant. So nitrogen is nitrogen, but the form it comes in really matters to how it works in the soil relative to the life in the soil.
Right. And so let's get to Tom's question. What happens then with respect to nutrient density?
Yeah, so one of the things we looked at in What Your Food Ate was a deep dive into really what happens when those relationships change. And we found sort of 4 areas where there's really good evidence that farming practices affect what gets into our food via much of it modulated via the connections we've been talking about through the soil microbiome. And those things are micronutrients, sort of minerals and vitamins that are plants use exudates to recruit microbes that will acquire those for them or stimulate them to make. And what are those things? Things like zinc or iron that, we need in our bodies, or copper. It's an essential element for our health and in supporting our immune system. But we can't eat pennies to get copper. We need the plants to eat the rocks to basically get the copper into the biomass so we can eat. And it turns out soil life is the agent that really helps facilitate that. So you cut down on the exudates, you cut down on the micronutrient flow, the minerals that we need to build enzymes and that crops need as well. So there's the micronutrients, the minerals and vitamins, phytochemicals, plant-made chemicals is the root of the word, things that plants make in response to environmental stimuli, including from the microbial world. And those can be things that really help with plant defense and that have positive effects when they get into our bodies as well. There's also microbial metabolites, as Anne was talking about earlier, with those plant growth promoting hormones, the things that microbes turn that exudate food into that then helps benefit the plants. Many of those metabolites, when they get into us, have beneficial impacts on our health. And the fourth area is that there's really strong evidence for effects are what we feed our animals in terms of our meat and dairy products. And we could go deep into that, but there's the fat balance is greatly affected. If you feed cattle, for example, a dominantly corn or soy-based derived diet, they're going to be rich in omega-6 fats, which are pro-inflammatory fats in the human body for the most part. And if they were eating leafy greens out grazing grass and pastures or a diverse set of forages, they tend to be richer in omega-3 fats. Those omega-3 fats, that balance of omega-3 and 6 fats, they're both essential for our health because you want inflammation to be active in your body when you need it. You cut your finger in the kitchen, you want inflammation to start fighting whatever's getting in off that knife. But you want it to stop when it's not needed anymore. And if you look at a lot of the chronic illnesses that affect the majority of Americans today, they're rooted in diet that's rooted in sort of inflammatory effects that are impacted by diet. So those four areas, the micronutrients, the metabolites, the fat balance, and the phytochemicals are all things where you can find solid evidence in the agronomic world about how our farming practices affect those. And then you turn and go into the medical literature and you go, oh, those are things that actually are good for our health. They not only help us survive as macronutrients do, the things that we need to stay alive, but they help us thrive. And it turns out that our farming practices have had big impacts on those in the last 80 years and had less impact on, the basics that we need to survive. Which is why there's some arguments in the nutritional world about, what to call different things, what is actually a nutrient. And we had to dive deep into that, into what your food ate to try and parse it all out. But it was an interesting dive. And boy, there's some pretty strong effects that haven't been really acknowledged as widely as they should be in terms of thinking about the broad brush of public health and how we would best support that. And one of the conclusions we came to in What Your Food Ate is that when we think about agricultural policy, we need to think about it as a form of health policy.
Yeah, and to go back to phytonutrients, phytochemicals, there's an emerging evidence that diets rich in phytochemicals are good for fighting off cancers. To go back to cancer, and I think sort of chronic inflammation among the many conditions that it helps trigger, I think cancer is one of them.
Yeah. And just a note on that, people, there's this whole sort of area where people say you don't really need phytochemicals in your diet. We know you need carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And that whole argument revolves around, well, phytochemicals don't really fuel cell growth. It's not what's getting an infant from tiny into adult size. It's not the consumption of phytochemicals. It's carbohydrates largely, and the proteins and fats. And so when it comes to phytochemicals, I think that's why they, sort of were pushed off to the side, because they weren't really a part of growth. But we now know, okay, so we've grown all this biomass, infant to adult. How are you going to take care of that biomass? Like, what is the equivalent of the vacuum cleaners and the brooms and the scrubbies and all of that? And that's where phytochemicals come in, because they are, to use that overused metaphor of, the tool in the toolbox. I always say Phytochemicals are the whole darn hardware store. What they are doing through their various activities, they're basically these master inflammatory, keeping inflammation at levels that are healthy and normal. They're really good at that, and they're really good at repairing cellular damage due to just living. Cells are burning fuel, and like cars, there's junk that gets produced as a byproduct, and you want that to get out of your body and out of your cells. And so this is where phytochemicals are very helpful for human health, is all of this cleanup and tidy up, and let's just keep things working normally. And so that's why we want them in the human diet.
Yeah, and just to say this really briefly, I have never seen good evidence that phytochemical supplements do very much. They seem to work their magic best in the form of whole foods. We can't just create a phytochemical pill that's going to deliver this stuff.
Yeah.
So, okay, now we've talked about the way that we're doing things now. Let's now shift into defining what regenerative agriculture is. And one of the things you guys do really beautifully in What Your Food Ate is sort of make it concrete by visiting a bunch of farms and talking to a bunch of farmers. So I wonder if you could sort of define regenerative ag and tell some of these stories that you found along the way.
Yeah, the definition I like for regenerative ag is actually fairly simple, and that's agricultural practices that build and maintain soil health. So it's having a positive vector so that the more you farm, the better and more healthy and fertile your soil actually is. And why do I like keeping it that simple? Because it's the exact opposite of what we've mostly done for the last 10,000 years in most parts of the world, including in many traditional practices where they helped sustain fertility, but the clock ran out eventually if you're basically even marginally degrading land as a result of farming. So it's a challenge to figure out how to actually build fertility as a consequence of intensive farming. And there's sort of a minimum of a set of three principles that I think really work for that. And that is minimizing the physical and chemical disturbance of the soil, keeping the land covered with growing roots so the exudates that we've been talking about are produced sort of year round or whenever they can be in that particular environment, and growing a diversity of plants, growing a diversity of crops. So minimal disturbance, which translates into either no or low till and minimal chemical use, planting cover crops in between cash crops or a diversity of cash crops in a rotation, and growing diversity. Now, it turns out that those three things are virtually the exact opposite of modern conventional agriculture, right? But those three things go together because it's a recipe for cultivating the beneficial life in the soil, for building those symbiotic partnerships. Provide those organisms a habitat, food, and a community to interact with. So that's sort of the recipe for thinking about that. And we came to that through visiting farms around the world who had actually restored life to degraded land in the same way that Anne restored life to our degraded lot that we bought in Seattle when we bought a house. And I guess maybe I'll tell one example and maybe Anne can tell another example. But the one that really impressed me most sort of early on in thinking about this was visiting some farms in South Dakota with a gentleman named Dwayne Beck, who used to run the research center at South Dakota State University. And he took me out to a farm that was about a 20,000 acre farm, a huge farm, totally mechanized, right? Growing mostly commodity crops, but they'd gone to no-till. They had integrated cover crops into their rotations. So they weren't just growing the cash crops. They were growing other things in between and quite a diversity of them. And then they would rotate fairly well. And they had really improved their soil over the course of about half a decade in ways that you could notice by just digging a hole in their fields, going across the street, across a dirt road, same soil, same climate, growing the same cash crops, different methods. You look at the soils and one is chocolate brown and the other is like khaki. And you kind of go, one of these is healthy and fertile and the other one is completely degraded. And that farm had not completely gone to organic methods. They had gone to what I call organic-ish methods, where they had basically they greatly reduced their nitrogen fertilizer use by more than 50%. They'd almost gotten completely off of herbicides at this large scale, growing crops that their neighbors are like nuking with herbicides. It really impressed me that these kinds of regenerative practices could work at scale on highly mechanized farms, because it's one thing for them to work on fairly small, labor-intensive farms, which can be great and super productive at building soil health and super productive at producing food. But unless we all want to be farmers, it's got to be able to scale too. And so that really made an impression on me. And what made the sort of lasting bit of the impression there was that by so reducing their nitrogen and pesticide use, they'd basically increased the profitability of their farm because they'd maintained their yields while cutting their costs. So it was a case where the interests of the environment were really lining up with the hyper-local economic interests of the farmer. And that started to turn the optimist bulb on for me. And Ann could probably tell you about maybe one of the other folks we visited.
So we visited, for What Your Food Ate, we visited two really intensive vegetable production farms. And these were not anywhere near the size of this farm in South Dakota. These were, several acres. One was in California and one was in Connecticut. And what was really interesting about these two settings is that they were, other than growing vegetables, they were different in just about every way. And yet both sets of farmers had been able to build some pretty incredible soil through their methods. And I think the only thing I would add, this just makes me think about the definition of regen and what it is. And you'll often hear when you talk to regenerative farmers that they often talk about it. I think it's really interesting, Tom. They talk about it as a journey. They don't ever think they've arrived and there's nothing more to do. And I just find that interesting because I think it gets at sort of the iterative nature of what makes for a good farmer. It also gets at that you need to be curious if you're going to be a farmer. And it also gets at you cannot just be sitting there on a tractor for your entire farming career. You got to get off. You got to walk around. You literally got to get your hands in the soil and see what's happening. And so those are sort of qualities of both of these farms in Connecticut and California. And what they did, well, I think what struck me most, especially as a person who grows plants, is just the incredible diversity of veg crops that they had. I think the O'Hara's out in Connecticut, it was like, I don't know, somewhere between 12 and 20 crops that we were looking at, all crammed into a pretty small area. And what both these farmers also did is, the minute a crop was harvested, they were on that bed the next day, either sowing new seed or getting seedlings in. And both of these farmers also paid incredible attention to their organic matter sources and levels. And they were both, and I'm a person who likes to talk about organic matter a lot. So it was a great visit with these farmers because there's a lot to talk about when it comes to organic matter. What are your sources and what do you think you're getting out of it? And how much do you apply and how is it interacting and all of that? And so these folks were both on top of that. And I will say the other interesting thing to me, they also did not use, they were really, really focused on minimal disturbance to their soils. And so the folks in California, when it came to harvest time, they weren't like ripping a plant up by its roots and then getting a rototiller in there and redoing the whole bed. They were quickly going by, slicing off the cabbage or whatever the crop was. And right behind was a person coming in with, they tended to use starts in their case. They grow all their own stuff. And so it was minimal disturbance and acting quickly with getting your new crop in. And then, especially in California, which is so challenged with drought, getting mulch, some kind of mulch material immediately on that bed because they irrigate. And so and water is an issue. What I found really interesting between these two places, California, which is not getting enough water, Connecticut, those guys were getting, flooded with water. They both had nowhere near the problems that their neighbors did. the O'Hara's fields were not getting flooded out. Why? Because they had so much organic matter that all of that water was absorbed and held in, the dead microbes, the dead plants, the other dead animals. And the same in California. All of that water was getting absorbed and stored. And so this is where, it's another example of, wow, a farming method that's actually taking care of another environmental problem. I love that.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at just is how regenerative agriculture on a grand scale, like what you saw in South Dakota, or on these smaller scales, requires a lot of attention and skill and cleverness, and it's a profession that could, if we set our system up right, could attract a lot of bright young people, because it does require so much creativity. It's so interesting. You never know what you're gonna, every year is a little different, and our system is almost set up to stop that because of super high land prices, et cetera, which is a topic for a whole podcast series, I think, sort of land prices and how we're going to get this creative new crop of farmers onto land. But so, David, I've been thinking a lot about, and not just recently, but probably for 15 years, about the fate of soil in the U.S. heartland, in the Corn Belt. And one of the things that I remember reading the year that it came out was your really amazing and seminal book, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, which is a sort of a book that spans a lot of history and geography. And you have a statement in there where you say that with just a couple of feet of soil standing between prosperity and desolation, civilizations that plowed through their soil vanish. A very, sort of bone-chilling kind of idea that you document rigorously. And I wonder, from where you are in Seattle, looking at what's going on in the Corn Belt right now and for the past half century or so, are we moving in that direction?
Unfortunately, the answer is yes. The gentleman who did there's a series of actually papers that have come out in the Corn Belt now that were actually led by my graduate student, Isaac Larson, who's gone on to UMass Amherst, where he's doing amazing work on this very topic, where he's basically managed to do a study across the whole U.S. Corn Belt, trying to look at what's happened to the soil in the last 150 years, the sort of the era of conventional agriculture. And what he's able to document is that roughly 1/3 of that area has lost its topsoil. And in the soil science parlance, that's the A horizon. It's where all the organic matter is. It's where the fertility is. And so how do you keep farming once you've lost the A horizon? Well, you can plow up the B horizon and add massive amounts of agrochemicals to replace everything that nature would naturally do with fertile soil. And it's been happening sort of on a micro scale where it's been just sort of shuffled around from the high points to the low points. But one of the methods that they used that I thought was really quite clever was going to bits of native prairie or cemeteries across the Corn Belt and surveying the height of the places where, you're not going to plow up and great grandma. So those areas tend to be a little higher than the cornfields. He did high resolution surveying across them and documented that many of those places have lost, up to almost half a meter, about to like 1.5 feet of soil over the course of a century and a half of farming. Most places in the world, the soil is only about, 1.5 feet to a couple feet thick. And the UN's Global Soil Database backs that up. The problem is kind of similar globally, too, in the sense that there's a UN Global State of the Soil report from 2015 that looked at the magnitude of soil loss that's ongoing today. And if you project their numbers out for the rest of this century, we're on track to lose about 1/4 of our ability to feed ourselves just through soil degradation at a time when our population is supposed to rise by about that much. And if you look back through history, we've already degraded somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the world's farmland to the point where it's no longer an agricultural production. that's negligent planetary stewardship right there. I mean, if we're talking about how do you feed, a 10 billion person world going forward, the first thing on your agenda ought to be, well, how do we get as much fertile, healthy land as possible to grow food for everybody? So, we're kind of slowly repeating the story that I wrote about in Dirt at a global scale. But I've become something of an optimist on the issue because of the changes I've seen in the way regenerative farms are able to turn that story around in pretty short order. We did for What Your Food Ate, Ann and I did a little paired farm study across 20 farms across the U.S., 10 pairs of farms, a regenerative one and a conventional one next door. And the regenerative ones had been adopting these practices based on those minimal disturbance, cover crops, and good crop diversity for anywhere between 5 and 10 years, which geologically, it's like a snap of your fingers. It's really fast. We found they doubled the topsoil organic matter in the upper 6 to 8 inches of their soil, the part that matters for fertility. And that's carbon that's been put into the ground and turned into a source of fertility instead of a source of global warming. And I started to turn into an optimist, seeing how some of the economics and environmental interests are starting to line up and realizing just how fast we could, in principle, restore fertility to our land if, and it's a big if, we farmed differently.
And what about you? How are you, tell me what worries you and what you're optimistic about when you look out at the status quo and you sort of lift your head out of all the scientific studies and away from the computer screen where you're writing and sort of think about where we're headed with agriculture going forward.
Yeah. I think one of the things we probably all can relate to, especially, as you get into the later decades of your life, is whenever you go back maybe to where you grew up or somewhere familiar to you, maybe initially it looks pretty much the same, but as time goes on, you begin to see what's been lost. And that, is certainly the case for me. I grew up in the suburbs of Denver, and now places that were completely vacant and didn't have anything there are now filled with all kinds of things. And so it's sort of just the steady erosion, so to speak, of losing natural habitats and losing nature. That concerns me a great deal because you play that out and pretty soon there's is there anything left that we haven't built upon? Maybe the oceans, maybe rivers. I'm not, water. We definitely move water around and manipulate it a lot, but we're not all out on houseboats yet. So I get concerned about that, Tom. But what gives me hope, I think, is when I think about, there's the big narratives and there's what we all see in the so-called news about just the doom and gloom. You could pick anything, agriculture, anything else that is hard to be around. And yet what really gives me hope is when I'm able to get out to a farm or I'm at, say, speaking at a conference or something like that. And I look around and I'm like, oh my God, there's hope. I can't, I'm going to fall out of my chair here. And then I'm going to go sit in my chair again and just absorb all of this. Because all this ingenuity and creativity that we have as human beings, I think that when we deploy that in ways that sort of restore functioning to the soil and to the planet, that is really powerful. And I put that whole thing kind of maybe under an umbrella that I'll call force of nature. And there's a big force there. And if we can figure out, I don't like words like harness, or if we can put it in a box or do something with it. I think what we really kind of need to do is stand back and observe how that force of nature is working. And then we insert ourselves in a dovetailed way, not in come in with a hammer and a chisel and all this stuff, but we come in a dovetailed sense and ask ourselves and start making changes that dovetail with the force of nature, because that is, all of these forces are what is running this planet from these, grand biogeochemical cycles like the nitrogen cycle and carbon and phosphorus and so on. Those are still running. Those are going to keep running long after we are gone. But to the degree that we can normalize our activities with the planet's activities, that I think is going to be key to a lot of this. And that's what gives me hope. And we're getting close. We're not there yet in Seattle to spring, but, in my kind of walks around the neighborhood, that's my main form of exercise, I will see tree roots. And I'm like, how come I never saw these tree roots before? Oh my God, they're lifting up this sidewalk, or I can see them crawling out toward that pile of organic matter. And I just see all this stuff, and it makes me think, wow, life, it's so amazing. If we give it half a chance and get our foot off of the neck of nature, there's so much that's possible.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end than that. Let us indeed take our foot off the neck of nature. And I just want to say, everyone out there, get these books and read them. If you want to understand the science around regenerative agriculture and the science around the way that we're doing things now and how it's leading us off of a cliff, there really is no better place to start than, you guys' work. So thank you so much for coming on Unconfined Podcast.
Well, thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and thanks for unconfining us.
Yes.
Okay.
Much appreciated.
You were confined before, but you are no longer confined.
All right.
In our podcast.
We feel liberated.
Go forth and have fun.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. This is an episode of Unconfined, a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu.